I like to say that like a good payments business, like there's so many examples of good payments businesses that are just like built by really strong ops people.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Payment Strategy Show. I'm Becky Kopplin, head of payments at Rainforest. We help software platforms embed payment processing into their core products to grow revenue and improve customer retention. And I am thrilled to be here today with Emily Bartels, who's VP of Payments at Jane App. Jane App is a practice management software for health and wellness practitioners that makes it easy to book, chart, schedule, bill, and most relevant to the show, get paid. So thank you so much, Emily, for joining me.
Thanks, Becky. I'm so excited to be on the show and chatting with you about payments today.
So you have an extensive amount of experience running payments through multiple vertical software companies. And I've got this theory, and I've mentioned it on the show before, but I don't think anyone gets into payments on purpose. And I think once you're here, you don't leave. So with that in mind, tell us all a little bit more about how you got started.
Well, it's been over 15 years now, I think, and I haven't left yet. So here we are. I've built a career off of, I think, a unique niche of just vertical SaaS and payments, specifically around embedding payments and platforms. How I landed here, my formative years, that is kind of my claim to fame, is MindBody. And I started there back in 2010, actually in sales. But the story with MindBody is it was our founder, the founder of MindBody, was very focused on payments from, call it day one, but the very, very early years. And so even back in 2010, when I was started in sales, we had to talk about payments on every single sale. We actually sold interchange plus pricing. In my little cubicle that I sat in, we had a piece of paper on the wall with interchange plus like volume discounted pricing that we could reference when we were quoting with customers. Every welcome email that we sent after we closed a deal, we had to, give them instructions on how to set up payments. So through that process, I really started to get exposed to payment processing because we really had to talk about it on every call. About 2 years went by and there was an opportunity that opened up on the payments team. There was a small payments team at MindBody, and it was just a topic that I was interested in. I really liked the team over there. So took an opportunity to join that team, and kind of the rest is history. From there, I really just kind of self-learner, went really deep into payments, taught myself. It was just a topic I found interesting, learned from the people around me. And then even back in the day, this was sort of before PayFac as a service existed. We had a lot of great partners in the payments business that I really credit to also helping educate me on the payments industry. And so, over a decade later, I, grew my career on the backs of the payments business at MindBody. And that's how I got in. And it doesn't look like I'm getting out anytime soon. So
I love that. And you recently joined Jane App as VP of Payments, but previously worked at Skimmer in addition to MindBody you've already referenced. And I think most of our listeners and most of the payments industry kind of recognize MindBody as one of the best and earliest examples of vertical SaaS, embedding and scaling payments. But how do you take the learnings, right? Kind of growing up in this MindBody arena, how do you take those to different verticals like field services or healthcare? And what's different about what you're doing at Jane App versus what you did before?
Yeah. So, across, Jane App, Skimmer, I've also done advising. And so I've been exposed to other vertical SaaS platforms at different stages of their payments journey as well. And I think one thing I've sort of taken for granted as I've now tried to apply my learnings and my experience to new companies is that, where the MindBody business was like an incredible payments business, but there's a few things. It was, again, like I had mentioned, the founder was very, very focused on payments from day one. It was the sort of the joke around the company was MindBody's just secretly a payments company, right? But we were a payments company, and all the way down to how the product was built. Payments was the beginning and the end. The product just did not work without it, right? And so there was never, the reason I share that context is that although we had pockets of verticals, like in the salon vertical, where we had low adoption or largely unattached customers, there was never a moment where there were thousands of customers that were not attached to payments that we needed to go attach to payments, right? So moving to a company that the other companies I've worked with, either as a consultant or Skimmer that I worked at that were a little later to the game in actually bringing payments to their customers. It's a very different motion to now think about how you've got to attach a back book of customers who already have established business processes like around how they do payments. And to me, I think I sort of like had been coined kind of this payment salesperson for a long time. But really, I've credit to the sales team at MindBody. They did like an incredible job. But it's definitely different when now you're talking to many, many customers in a particular vertical who this is a new thing for them and like trying to get that motion out there. So as far as the question goes on how do you take those learnings and apply it, I think I cautiously use playbooks and frameworks because there are things that work, right? And you can apply some of those, but you have to be aware that when you're going to Skimmer now at Jane, that healthy, growing, great payments opportunities and great payments businesses, but there are just nuances about the culture of the company, their customer base, size of customers, what that customer journey experience is. And you can't go in and just expect that to be the same and just repeat the playbook. You've got to be flexible to kind of accommodating the kind of organizational structure and culture that exists within the companies.
Yeah, and you talked about playbook, and it's kind of the same frame, same vocabulary that we use as well, and that I've used kind of throughout my career. And my kind of framing is 80% of the playbook is the same, right? And that 20% is where that makes it really special, right? That's what changes for field service, and maybe those numbers aren't exactly right, but there's some portion of it
conceptually,
that is the same. You hit on two things that I think MindBody really set the stage for that continues to be very true for successful embedded payments. The first one is culture and how critical good payment culture is top down. And you've credited that, now in a couple of ways to success. And I think that's brilliant. And the second one is kind of, it just doesn't work without it. And I think this is one of the concepts a lot of platforms really struggle to find, especially when they're retrofitting. But I think it's really key to making payments successful is to have the whole company have this approach where it just isn't going to work without it. I think one of the things that we do is we say something like, well, imagine upselling your reporting as a separate module to your clients. And people are like, well, it just doesn't work without the reporting. And we're like, okay, that's it. But make payments, that. So how have those two things feel so critical to me? How have you pulled those two things forward in Skimmer or Jane or in some of your other consulting work that you've done?
Yeah. And those are two really important things that the culture, and then you just sort of make payments disappear. It becomes so native. It's the obvious choice, whatever language that you want to use around that. And that, especially when you're actually trying to influence the culture or reshape how the existing team is thinking about payments. Again, this is a question on sort of how you set even a payments leader up for success, which we can talk about later as well, is that you need to create a vision for really that payments is not about just processing that payment. Payment is, again, I think I said it earlier, it's sort of the beginning and the end. And you have to think about that flow. And as you're building going forward, you may do certain things like release new features that are only available, if you're on payments, right? Or you may fix a problem in a way that's tied deeply to payments. And so you've just got to be, even though you may have a dedicated team to payments, you have to sort of spread that across the org and across other product leaders. So everybody's sort of thinking through the lens of how does payments actually make this better, right? And so that you don't actually get the full value out of the software without payments. And if you do it well enough, and I will generally die on this hill, is that for customers who aren't using payments or aren't fully adopting payments, it's actually not a payments sales problem. It's a customer success problem because they're actually not using the software in the way it was intended to be used. And they're likely going to turn off at some point if we don't figure out how to get them to actually see the full value of the software. And then payments really just becomes an output of using the software in the best way possible to support your business.
Yeah, I make a terrible joke, the Fight Club reference, which is kind of the best way to sell payments is to not talk about payments, because I think that selling workflow and output, I'm not selling payment, I'm selling a gym membership. I'm not selling payment, I'm selling a great day at the spa. I'm not selling payments, right? I'm selling, this full experience. And I think you're touching on that here, which is if it's a payments sales problem, it's probably somewhere else, right? It's a product integration problem. It's a success, team problem. There's something else in there, because payments that deliver value, like they buy your software and they love all that it does, which just happens to include payment.
It just happens to include it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As people are listening to this, they're kind of at all different stages of maturity, right? Our listeners, they might have not started payments. They may not even have started their company yet. They may be, kind of late to the game, and you've experienced all these different stages. But how do you decide like what needs to happen first versus what can wait? How do you prioritize that? And maybe to make that even more specific, did you have a plan when you stepped into this new role at Jane App?
Yeah, I'm still in my listening and learning phase. I'm still about 90 days in. But generally, when I'm either advising a company or stepping into a new role, I think, the question of what needs to happen first is also a question of kind of what are the broader organizational goals. But that aside, what I generally like to look for first is, do we have product market fit? So this is going back to scaling basics. The product that's been built today, is it actually solving customers' problems? And it may be solving a certain ICP of customer if you serve multiple disciplines or, size wise within in a particular discipline. And you've got to figure out where the product works well today and for what customer, because I'm a very competitive person and I like to put wins on the board quickly. And so when I walk into an organization, I want to figure out, where is it working and how can we accelerate that in tandem with figuring out where do we need to improve product market fit or create product market fit for other customer segments that we have? Because building product, the decisions and the complexities around that can tend to take a while. And so I like to figure out, it's not product or go to market first. It's let's figure out where there is good product market fit. And let's figure out how do we need to scale across our go-to-market motions. And then, and in parallel with that, trying to figure out, how we expand into different customer segments and what needs to be built that way. So
how do you, for a company that may not be, really payments affluent, how do you help them, or how do you determine what's working? How do you define working?
It's a good question. How do I define working? I think kind of going back to product market fit and how do you define product market fit? That is your definition. I would say if I'm looking at payments specifically, and I think an extreme example would be, let's say I have, a base of 2,000 customers and I have 100 of them that have signed up for payments, but the utilization rate on payments is sub 20%, right? That's probably a signal that something is not right. They're only using it for a particular use case, right? And you got to figure out what they're doing else. If you've got 100 customers and they're doing, 80, 60, 70, 80+% of their volume, and they're continue to grow on your platform, they're retaining, let's figure out who that customer segment is. And that's where we kind of define that, hey, we're having success in this particular area. How do we continue to grow that success? So I'm kind of answering the product market fit question again, but that's kind of the way I would think about it.
And that's helpful. And as you think about product market fit or payment specifically, how do you weight payment features specifically versus kind of workflow and integration elements within the product? Which one would you rank higher, or how would you rank those?
I don't really separate those. I feel like they're generally one and the same. I try to think about, I guess there are examples of a payment feature. Maybe a payment feature would be instant payouts or, T+1 versus T+2, those types of things. But how I rank those against workflow, it really just comes down to what your customers are asking you for. One, I mean, that informs a lot of the workflow. I don't like, it's 10 clicks to do this thing, or it doesn't do this thing for me, right? I would say generally customers aren't begging for something like instant payouts, but we know that it generally has pretty high adoption. And once you expose it to them, they'll start to use it. But I think most customers aren't running their business every day thinking about, oh, I want to be able to get my money right this instant, in like translating that to, oh, I wish Jane had an instant payout feature, or Skimmer had an instant payouts feature. Once it's exposed to them, they'll utilize it. But I think most of the time, if you're trying to solve a customer problem, it really comes down to that. What is the pain that they're feeling in their workflows, and how do you add value to those?
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Going back to a little bit of the culture conversation we were having earlier, coming in as a payments leader into a new company kind of comes with some organizational dynamics and maybe some thoughts about where payments should fit or how it should operate. Kind of what's your approach to understanding existing team and culture dynamics, specifically as it relates to payments?
So I always give myself a 90-day listen and learn. And I don't want to go in with any assumptions or preconceptions. It's hard sometimes when you're like experienced and you come in and so I really try to hold back, try not to give opinions early on either. And I think that helps to going through a listening and learning phase. Again, 60, 90 days really helps build like leadership capital when you just start to ask questions and just like humbly learn about the business. And I think that's just like a really important thing. Ask questions in ways that maybe get folks to think about things in a different way and potentially challenge their own thinking. Some companies just really don't have a great culture around payments because they don't understand it, right? They don't understand how it could be different. And so there has to be some like education and excitement that you need to build as a new leader coming in. I do think it's really important to actually be a friendly face, to be high energy, to like show and express your passion for payments, as nerdy as it is. Like you can like show up, and I don't want to discredit like how far that can take you to just be like humble listener in those first 90 days, bring good positive energy and kind of like bring excitement into the business. And then, depending on how that culture is also being set with an existing leadership team, like hopefully you're stepping into an org where it's already, there's a rally cry around it. But if there's not, there may be some, work that needs to happen to kind of help create that rally cry across, the other functional leaders in the business.
I think I would rank that kind of rallying cry as maybe one of the most important signals towards success payments in a business. Like, where would you put that? And would you rank anything higher?
I don't know that I would rank much of anything higher, but that rally cry can kind of manifest in different ways. It might be like really like a rally cry, right? It might be just aligning incentives across the leadership team, getting buy-in across everyone in the leadership team. So, how that actually manifests. But I think it is really, really important that payments is established as something that is really important and really strategic for the business.
Agree totally. A couple of the verticals that you've worked with, specifically thinking like field services or healthcare, they're really specialized. They've got a lot of unique aspects to them. So compliance, workflows, kind of their own payment challenges. How do you think about, building payments within a program that needs to be hyper tailored that way, like to healthcare practitioners, versus maybe more of a generic approach or what you did in field services?
Yeah, I apply the 80-20 rule here as well, that I actually think, whatever, maybe it's 70, maybe it's 60, but generally I think most of the workflows are pretty generic and applicable across disciplines. And then it's that 20% that is going to be unique to field service or a particular field service or healthcare. And I think sometimes there's a debate around solving, for the generic problems or do you do the customization? And really it's both. And I think that by holding on to that principle and just acknowledging that that's what makes us special. That's what makes our payments solution better than what you're going to get, independent of the software, is really that 20% of value. That's that extra value that you bring to the table.
Yeah, I love that and agree. I think a lot of our listeners kind of imagine how to hire for this role, right? Because you're talking a lot about like what the right person brings or what you've brought, right? When you with your, kind of deep expertise. And leaders are unsure kind of who to hire when for payments, whether you're hiring a generalist, a program manager, right? A payment support person, or you're really kind of going all in hiring a payments executive leader. And this matters kind of where they're at in their payments maturity as well and what their goals are around that. So, like, what do you think about the right kind of time to hire payments, and how should our listeners be thinking about staffing payments?
Yeah. It obviously depends, and every hire is going to be like very unique to your business and, evaluating who you have talent in place, right? If you're building something like from scratch, like actually building what the payments product is inside your business, that's probably going to be built by an existing engineer or product leader that you have. And maybe they're a generalist if you're very early stage. Maybe you're at a later stage company, you want to have payments for the first time. I would say recommend it like very first hire is you need to have somebody who indexes towards product that can actually build the thing that needs to be built first, right? I also think then you can kind of get by a little bit with testing your go-to-market motion across existing sales reps. Maybe you have an expansion team, customer success, where you start to really get that product out into the market and identify if you have that product market fit. What you also might find is, oh, now there's like all sorts of little things that need to get done. And I just need like a Swiss Army knife ops person that can just come in and just sort of make sure that all that stuff is getting taken care of and the business is like staying functioning and nothing collapses, right? And so there's like sort of that role that evolves. I like to say that like a good payments business, like there's so many examples of good payments businesses that are just like built by really strong ops people, like really strong operational people build really good businesses. You see countless examples of businesses that have grown to billions of dollars in volume. I think the right time to bring in like a really strong, like strategic payments leader that, can really look across the business, cover everything and kind of come into the business with a new lens is when you're really ready to get very serious and strategic about what is the next thing that's possible for this business. So like, just kind of say it again. I think that sort of good payments businesses are built by really strong ops people. So don't think that you need to bring in like kind of a very experienced leader right out of the gate, but a great business is really built with strategy. So when you really need to start thinking about where this business can go, I think that's the time where you start bringing in it's like a much more like senior payments leader that honestly will actually probably come into the business with, a remit that's even a little bit broader than payments as we think about expanding and, to other, fintech products or new bets that you want to make across the business.
Yeah, I love that, and I think you're right. We've seen that, time and time. Like some great folks that can build, some really really decent programs, but that strategic focus is what takes that, to a different level. That's when you expand that playbook. That's when that 20% becomes kind of really magical.
Magical, yeah,
yeah. I think there's a question that I've been asked a couple of times. I'm curious your take on it, but if the payments leader isn't sitting at, kind of the executive team level, kind of reporting to the CEO, where in the business do you think payments best fits if it needs to sit under an existing discipline? I get asked this pretty frequently, and I actually have some pretty strong opinions on it too, but I'm curious what yours is on it.
I don't know if I have a strong opinion on this yet. Maybe strong opinion loosely held, but it depends. What I would say is if you've identified that you have a good, strong product market fit and you've got thousands of customers that just need to get onboarded and attached to payments, maybe what you need is a really strong like payment sales leader. And that actually lives in the go-to-market or sales organization. If you need to have somebody who, if you're building obviously for the first time, that should be your product leader and they live in the product org. As you get somebody more senior in, generally I'm an advocate that this needs to be like an ELT level position, needs to report right to the CEO or another C level. And however, where that person potentially like indexes across the business, I generally probably index a bit more towards product because especially like how, the way of the world going forward and like really starting to think about like kind of what AI in the future and everything like brings to payments. I think it's just much more through like a product lens, but I could honestly argue both sides. So, yeah.
Yeah. That's funny. I like your approach. I think we're mostly aligned then. I like, obviously, payments at ELT level, I think is the most successful. I think revenue or product are kind of my next two options, depends on how those orgs are built. I think if you put payments under finance, which I've seen a couple of times, that is where it goes to die. I have very strong opinions that is a bad choice. So if any of our listeners disagree and have a great example of that working, but I've never seen that be successful.
Yeah. You put it in revenue, you put it in product. Again, like you're going to be successful in both places there. I think the most important thing is that you elevate that leader to have influence across the organization. And the other thing I would say too is like, when you get to scale and you're big and you're processing billions and, you want to bring in that more strategic leader, also like acknowledge that this person is likely comes from has experience now, right? It's sort of a payments plus role is the way I think about it, in that they're sort of on the ELT, they functionally own payments in the fintech side of the business, but you're hiring an experienced person at this point. So like anybody who sits on an ELT is going to have like a broader influence like across the organization in like a number of different ways. And I think what's unique about like a payments leader that I don't think gets kind of exposed enough is that I can't think of another role within an organization that like literally acts like a miniature CEO, like with inside of the company, right? That they have to be close to product. They have to understand finance. They need to understand go to market. Like you're literally running a little business inside of a business. And I think that really true GM style part of the role, there's a lot of skills that can come out of that experience. And I think it's important to think about how those can be sort of transferable or like kind of like reused across the organization as well. Yeah,
I agree. And I think that's almost true no matter what level of payment person you hire, is there needs to be some amount of appreciation for the cross-functional nature. And they really are in some ways acting as a GM, even if you're hiring someone who might be at a director level or even lower, is that functional. And I agree, like payments should be touching kind of nearly every aspect of the business. And especially if you're going to index on one hire or even just one or two hires within the role, you need somebody who can appreciate and at least speak the language of each of these other departments, because it doesn't exist well in a silo. It's not going to be successful in a silo. So it has to have that connection. So obviously, if you have a true GM of payments, they are that. I would argue it wouldn't matter what you hired. They have to have that kind of cross-functional approach.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I would say the other thing that I think is also a kind of a mental model that I have as well is that payments is also, it's like one part a shared service, like across the organization. And then it's one part like new bets, like growth, like how do I kind of do and develop this new strategy or product or whatever it might be across the company. So you're kind of balancing as this sort of like operational shared service, like function with, and sort of this growth, like, continues to be like a huge growth lever for the business as well.
And that's interesting because I feel like some people imagine or think about kind of embedded payments as kind of like call out embedded payments 1.0, right? It's that 80-20 playbook of let's get product market fit and get adoption and those kinds of things. But then there's kind of this new, embedded finance or embedded payments 2.0, where they think about what's then next. Lending, cards, banking, payroll, instant payouts, right? There's kind of a whole suite of things that folks might look to next. How should platforms be thinking about where to go with additional fintech products? And do you think the vertical matters on which one they should look at first?
I do think the vertical matters. The way I tend to think about it is like, I don't want to get too caught up on like long-term strategy, North Star. That's all great. And you need to go through that exercise. But there are certain things I think you don't need to overthink. And so, maybe, I think if you're going to do embedded banking, for example, I think it's like a really big decision to think about, like, what is the value that you're actually bringing to a customer? And is this revenue cycle management? Is it reconciliation? Is there some value in having that bank account that delivers, something better than what, a Chase bank account gives to their customers? I think that's a bit bigger thing that can get really interesting if you think about it strategically well enough. And it takes a lot of intensive planning. That would be like a big, call it a, tier 3 launch, project. Other things, I think you just need to not overthink, like instant payouts. Don't overthink it. It's actually pretty easy to just embed in your product. Like maybe the challenge is finding the happy home for it to, expose it in a right place and not make it this sort of annoying thing or something that shows up in the software. But hey, this shouldn't take a quarter's work of roadmap work to do. And so I think that there's some things that you just need to move on and just kind of get them out there. And even if you just do move it in like, more of a testing type of environment, or call it experimental or whatever it might be. So I like to think about, like, where can you start to sort of test and experiment in areas that are, two-way doors, like instant payouts. Oh, everybody hates it. Just take it out, right? Like that's not going to happen, but to try to think about how you add speed to testing and what things you just shouldn't overanalyze, so that you can concentrate on how you think about what needs to happen next as you go to payments 2.0, 3.0, more strategically for your business. You can put some more mind share to that and not be distracted by noise, and you can just start to get things out and test them.
Yeah. So kind of this like parallel paths of big strategic bets that you research and take time on. And then in parallel, you kind of doing these fail fast, like just push it out and see how folks react.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I love that. So kind of as a final question for our listeners who are kind of thinking about making that first hire that we talked about earlier, or maybe they have just made that first hire, like what's the one thing that our listeners should think about that really sets that leader up for success and make sure that their embedded payments focus is best chance to succeed?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that rally cry, and that rally cry, or however that manifests in your org, starts before you bring that person into your organization. Like you really want from day one, you want your team to be excited that this person is joining your team. It is like really difficult, really in any role, to sort of step in and, okay, why are you here? Like, what are we doing? I don't understand. I think it's just really important for, to set this person up for success, that rally cry happens before their first day, so that you can get the team excited, and you as a CEO or leader of the company can really start to pave the way for that culture. And then, your leader can come in and really just not have to spend too much time doing that, and can really kind of hit the ground running.
I love that answer. That's fantastic. And I am so thankful that you were able to join us today and share with us this vast set of knowledge you've accumulated over all of these years in payments. So thank you so much, Emily, for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Becky. It's been great. Yeah, this was long overdue. So excited.